you have to be rich, you have to have gone to Oxbridge. To become a barrister, we've spoken about nepotism, salary expectations being a bit taboo. Does everybody have to be called Nick to become a barrister?
That is one of the requirements.
It's
somewhere in the rules. No,
it's a place steeped in tradition, but what's the reality like? Is it changing? Hello, and welcome back to the Breaking Them podcast. For this episode, we're honoured to be joined by Leah and Zeolla, two future barristers. Leah is currently a pupil at 3 Hare Court Chambers and holds degrees from UCL, City, Oxford and Cambridge. He is also founder of the Young Bar Mentoring Scheme. Zeolla is a bar course student and future pupil barrister at a commercial chambers in London. Both are grazing scholars and both met at the Hague Academy of International Law. They are high achievers with an impressive array of achievements and accolades between them. So without further ado, welcome Nick and Nick to the Breaking Them podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome, guys. Great to be here.
Okay, so we're going to have a bit of a challenge differentiating between you two.
Yep.
So we're just going to say Nick generally when we ask a question. Whichever one of you'd like to take the question can take it.
All right.
If we have to, we'll refer to Leah as Nick L and Zeolla as Nick Z, if that's okay.
Sounds good to me, Alex.
Okay, cool. So some of you may have noticed we already have an episode on law. That was more focused on the solicitor route. Today is a bit more about the alternative in the UK, the barrister route. So Nick, would you mind running us through the legal system in the UK, how it works and what the difference is between solicitors and barristers?
Do you want me to kick off? Or?
Go on, kick off.
Okay.
The legal system in the UK is a big topic.
A big topic. Anything I omit, you can add in the gaps. Well, just to start us off, there is a distinction, obviously, between a barrister and a solicitor. Crudely speaking, barristers are courtroom advocates. And they spend time preparing submissions, be them written or oral, to be delivered in a courtroom or a tribunal setting, and therefore they're based generally in self-employed practice, but you can be an employed barrister and work for a law firm or another organisation, and then solicitors generally work in a law firm of varying size. I'm sure that you've had someone on the podcast at a big city law firm, but of course you can have smaller high street solicitors firms, which actually make up a large percentage of the legal work done in the UK. And then not to forget that there are other types of lawyers like patent attorneys, which fill a slightly different role, and they tend to have a scientific background when they're dealing with issues like intellectual property law. I think that's a very crude reduction. Would you add anything there, Nick?
Maybe that a good analogy I was given, and it might be a bit unfair on solicitors, I'm not sure, but it's what sticks in my mind, and it's what I tell people, is that a solicitor is more like, if we think about the medical profession, a solicitor is more like a GP, whereas a barrister would be like a surgeon. They're experts in the law, they're courtroom advocates often, and solicitors they play a more varied team-based role.
To be fair, it is important to mention that solicitors can appear before all of the courts of England and Wales in this jurisdiction now. So they have what's called higher rights of audience, which they didn't used to have. So it's not the case that solicitors can't perform the courtroom advocate role of barristers. It's just that barristers are trained in a specialist way to acquire those skills and have a long-standing tradition within the Inns of Court, and different chambers around the country of doing that. So there is a distinction, and it tends to be that solicitors instruct barristers. So one has to be nice about solicitors because they are your employers, as it were, in some way or another, in that they will feed you the work and they will ask counsel to appear in court on behalf of a case that they have with their lay client, or indeed to instruct you to write a piece of advice, for example.
I think, should we talk about the sort of criminal civil law distinction, because
let's do that.
When we're talking about barristers and solicitors, there's a big difference between the criminal and civil law world. So criminal is what it says on the tin, it's crimes and prosecuting crimes, And as a barrister in criminal law, you'll be in court a lot. You will often be direct access or working with solicitors, and that's different to the civil law, which we're both going into, which is non-criminal act.
Yeah, and it's basically, again, crude reduction, which is not entirely true in all cases, but crime is about punishing people for wrongdoing, and civil law is about compensating people, or finding ways to provide an adequate remedy where there's been a civil wrong. So that could be a breach of contract. You might be doing a fair amount of that in commercial chambers. It could be a tort that's committed, so a breach of duty of care, and someone or a company might be seeking damages, so compensation for that. So that's the sort of distinction. And what that looks like in practice is that criminal barristers go to court almost every day, because there's huge amounts of criminal work out there, and there's a real backlog at the moment, and there's a real concern around funding, and there's been a lot of issues around legal aid, and criminal barristers on strike recently. Civil barristers don't face those same financial pressures because they tend to have private clients, but at the same time the work is very varied, from big companies through to people who need a barrister to help them with a case that they may have involving a problem at work or an injury that they've suffered, something like that. So I think,
and that means it can also be quite paper-based as well.
Yeah.
So a lot of your work is writing written advices, preparing submissions, and you might not even get to court in a lot of cases, which is very different. But it's still advocacy. I think at the core, all of this is advocacy. It's arguing.
Definitely. I heard a good statistic recently. This might not be true, of course, it has to be verified, but I think only 4 to 5% of all personal injury cases actually ever go to court on the trial of the merits of the case. So most of them actually settle. The parties agree to settle the dispute before they actually get to court. So a lot of the time what you're doing is little applications along the way as the case develops, but ultimately many cases, the vast majority of cases, never actually end up in court. They do end up settling. So it's interesting to mention that, and not everyone knows it.
They don't show you the amount of procedure involved on TV at all.
No,
you just see the juicy substantive.
Right. Yeah. It's all about procedure, and you know about this right now doing the bar course. So.
Yes.
I think that's a brilliant overview.
It was super well explained.
It would be good to know as well how early on a barrister's involved in the process. I've heard of hospital runs where barristers get the papers the night before a trial. It can be a bit last minute. Yeah. Is that always the case?
I don't think it's always the case. I think that's more likely to be the case in crime. I think owing to the funding constraints, it often places pressures on barristers to get things done last minute, and indeed the professional client solicitors may have their own pressures as well. There are also problems with the administration of the criminal courts, and I know that they're trying to improve that. With civil work, not always, but I anecdotally heard of someone within my chambers having to turn around a piece of work in 3 hours on Friday before 4 p.m. And sometimes you will have those sorts of constraints. The reason being, again, it will come on to this from the sort of procedural side on the bar course, but is that there are strict time limits to a lot of things you have to do, and therefore you need to get those things done. And if you don't, you run the risk of having your case struck out, and therefore not going anywhere. And then just to come back on what point do the barristers come into this whole picture? It tends to be at the very end, to be honest, because litigation is the final resort. You don't really want to have to go to court if you can avoid it. If you can mediate, if you can negotiate a settlement beforehand, litigation is the final option. And it's an adversarial system, so it necessarily involves combat and competition between different sides. So we do get involved towards the end of the process, but sometimes you might be asked to advise on whether or not they should actually go to court and fight a case, in which case you can be involved a little bit earlier, but we tend to come in at the end.
Yeah, and there'll be usually a team of solicitors who've been preparing the case for weeks, months, sometimes longer, and then they call the barrister in when they know it's going to court or in contemplation of court.
Mm-hmm.
Very briefly, before we move on, there's a lot of terminology, and it would be good to know how things are structured too in terms of the Inns of Court, chambers, and what a tenant is, what a court of the bar is, what a pupillage is, and so on. Would you mind quickly running us through those things too?
Yeah, this is the hardest question because it's also old-fashioned, and I struggle to explain it to my parents or anyone, but we can give it a go. So as Nick said,
we'll get used to this. Yeah,
all barristers or most barristers are self-employed practitioners, but they work within a set of chambers, which is a collection of self-employed barristers who each rent a room from that chambers. And Nick's a pupil barrister, which is the vocational stage of training that you have to undertake in a chambers. And if you do good enough, which we're sure Nick will, they give you...
Touch wood, is there wood around? Okay, there is.
They then decide to give you a room and you become a tenant and you're a practicing member of that chambers. Now, it gets a bit more complicated because all these chambers exist within 4 different, in essence, estates in London, but they can be, well, they are across the country, but there's 4 Inns of Court, which are almost educational and professional institutions for barristers. Every barrister has to be part of an Inn of Court, and the chambers rent land and buildings off that Inn of Court, and you have to be called to the bar of one of the Inns of Court to be a practicing barrister. So we're both members of Gray's Inn, which is, I think, where we met probably.
Yeah, it's where I met.
They guide you through the educational and training stage. We're both beneficiaries of scholarships from Gray's Inn, which have enabled us to do, I think, the GDL bar course. I'm currently living in the inn on the scholarship, which is a great experience, and Nick did as well. So they support you through, unlike in the solicitor route where you might get a training contract quite early on in undergrad, and that will fund you the way through. You never know whether you'll get pupillage at the bar. It's all an uncertainty until you get it. So the support that's there is from the Inns of Court.
I'm just gonna, I think that's really good. Just to kind of draw the parallels with the solicitor language, because that might be useful for your listeners. Solicitors obviously undertake a training contract. Barristers undertake a pupillage. Training contract's 2 years, pupillages are 1 year. But sometimes, if you don't get taken on as a tenant, you might have to do what's called a third six. I hope that doesn't happen to me, but it does happen to a fair number of pupil barristers. It's not necessarily you're not of the standard. It might just be that they're unable financially to take on a certain number of tenants that year. But then you would do a third 6 months, because people are just broken up into a first 6 months and a second 6 months at a different chambers. And on that, the first 6 months, which I'm currently doing right now, is a non-practicing period at most chambers, in fact at all chambers I think. But the second 6 months at some chambers, at mine, for example, I will be able to practice, I'll be able to take on some of my own work, but under my supervisor's insurance, which is a slightly daunting prospect that if I mess up, that my supervisor takes the fall, and obviously I hope I don't. But that's how they set it up. In your second 6 months, you're sort of on probation, and then if you secure tenancy, it's a bit like becoming a newly qualified solicitor, having got through your training contract. Then you are self-employed and you take your practice wherever you want to take it. But I think am I right in saying that your chambers, you won't be doing a practicing second six? Some don't do that.
Some don't, and I think especially at the commercial bar in general, some prefer to have a year of training, and then as soon as you're done, you start practicing. So for me, it's a bit more like a master's. There's a lot of exams, there's a lot of test papers, there's advocacy exercises, and then by the end, if you reach the sort of standard, then they take you on, is what they've told me. But it's different everywhere, and for sure in criminal, you'll be practicing as soon as you reach that 6 month period. Nick will be as well, but doing civil cases.
And I don't think I'll be doing it every day. So in my chambers, they want to get us into court about 2 times a week, possibly a little bit more, which is really good. It's a good experience to get on your feet, to cut your teeth in, not saying they're unimportant cases, because they're not. Every case is important to the client, but cases of lower value where you can have a go at cross-examining a witness and putting forward your arguments in front of a judge or a tribunal. And you really do need that experience because, you know, a big part of the role is public speaking, and it helps if you can get that experience in early. So,
And you get paid.
you do, yeah. I mean, that's also the great thing is you can retain the earnings. You retain your own brief receipts from those instructions in the second 6 months. So that's really nice. So actually, maybe this would be helpful, that the way pupillage tends to work in terms of pay is you tend to get an award, which is, I think I can say this, non-taxed in the first 6 months. That's a long-standing tradition, effectively because the bar considers that you are a student in those first 6 months. You're in your vocational training still, as Nick said, and your second 6 months, while you're still a pupil, but you are in a practicing phase. You might not be in a practicing phase in all circumstances, but I think even at a non-practicing chambers like the one you're going to, that your second 6 earnings would be taxed.
Yeah.
So that's how it works. These sort of financial considerations matter, though, so it's always important to mention it to people.
That was a really, really good overview. And while you already covered the difference between solicitor and barrister, could you expand a bit more on your reasoning why you chose this route?
Can I go first?
Me first. I think I considered both. I started off going to solicitor events at undergrad, and I think that convinced me that I wanted to be a lawyer. I didn't know much about the bar then, and I found that as a non-law student, a lot of it was geared around getting training contracts anyway. And yeah, I was interested. I made applications. I kept scoping it out. But then I can't remember what the exact moment was, but I applied to do a moot at King's College London. And it was after that first experience of standing up or preparing a case, taking it to a room, standing up, and then presenting it and being challenged on it. Even though that moot went terribly, it's the adrenaline afterwards.
Had a few of those.
I just thought this is the coolest thing, that you can do this as a job. And I did a mini pupillage after that, and that sort of cemented the idea that the practicalities of the job, it was like essay writing to me, but you get to argue it. So that was the sort of initial thing, but the overall point is that the independence of it suits me a lot. I want to be self-employed. I want to have a lot of responsibility. I like being outside of my comfort zone. I think the bar constantly puts you outside of your comfort zone. So those are the top things for me.
Similar to me, I did some work experience when I was in sixth form. I remember this very well, going to Winchester Crown Court with the circuit judge and sitting there thinking, wow, this is amazing, you know, with the wigs and gowns on, these barristers persuading the jury. Now, I know I'm not going down the criminal barrister route, but I was pretty taken by what I saw that day. And then spent some time at university seeing both law firms and barristers' chambers. And it just was the setting and the skill sets of a barrister that sold it to me and made me realise that's really what I want to do. But I think a point of realisation was I did a master's degree, and I've always enjoyed academic research and taking time to analyse a problem, as it were, go to the archives, find the sources I need to answer the question. And I do think that being a barrister is much like that. You have to do the preparation before you can make your arguments, be it, you know, written arguments or in person in a courtroom or a tribunal. So it was the skill set that really sold it to me as well.
Same for me though. I think it was almost a good alternative to being an academic. That was my other option at the time. I was considering continuing doing history, so I really did love it. But there's a bit more adrenaline as a barrister, but it's still very academic.
Yeah.
There was also an element of people telling me that it's so competitive and you won't be able to make it, and that got me going and made me want to sort of prove people wrong. I thought it was just a massive conspiracy that everyone just kept saying it's so hard to become a barrister. I thought I'll give it a shot and then work my way down if it doesn't work out.
On that, I'll just jump in because this is important, because some people will look at, you know, the qualifications and the sort of resume of barristers and just go, oh my word, this is ridiculous. You know, how on earth could I see myself doing that? And I'm sure you'd agree with that. You've done that at some point in your life before applying. I certainly did that. You know, my sort of mouth would drop in awe. But then that's not what you should be doing. You should be thinking we're all, with our own talents and we're all individuals, and you should never compare like for like, because that person, had that same experience as you whenever it was when they were applying. And then they've acquired those different experiences, different degrees, mooting experiences. They may have won some awards for things they've done, pro bono work, whatever it is. They've acquired these, but you can't just have those on your CV immediately. It takes time. So perseverance is always something that you have to have in this trade. It takes stamina, and I certainly applied to a lot of places before getting the role I did. So it's a competitive place, but it's worth keeping that in mind.
Yeah, and question for you guys, for both of you actually. What's the common career path for a barrister? Now, for a solicitor, I'm guessing, you grow up, you watch Suits, and you're like, okay, this is what I want to do. This is super, super interesting. But that seems like the solicitor, more of that. Before you do the bar, what do you think students should be doing? What might be motivating students? Is there something similar to the whole solicitor route that there is for barristers? And then after the bar as well, what does a career look?
Yeah, I think you're closer to this.
I just think it's so diverse compared to solicitor. People are coming at it from all different angles. A lot of my friends are older than me. Some are ex-nurses, some are ex-academics. I've gone straight through, but I don't think that's the most common option at all. Mm-hmm. That's what I've really liked about it. You'll be studying alongside people coming from all different angles, career changes, but all with a common interest and wanting to do the same thing. So I think that's quite unique compared to solicitors.
It's fantastic. The average age of becoming a barrister is probably a bit higher, I think, than becoming a solicitor. Mm-hmm. And I think that, what's wonderful is you have people who've, as Nick said, done a whole range of careers before deciding that actually they want to be a courtroom advocate. And maybe it is that for example, I met someone this summer in the US who was, it's true, a captain of a super yacht, and now wants to go into shipping law. And he's now a barrister, and he's getting his experiences in that field. He's got an obviously incredible sort of nautical understanding of how to operate super yachts, which I wouldn't have the foggiest clue about. And then there are other examples like, those that have been partners or have been senior associates of law firms, and they want to make the transition. They decide that they want to have more of an advocacy-based practice. So there is literally no one type that fits the bar. It's an incredibly diverse range of people from different backgrounds. Okay, there are a fair number who've just studied, like myself. I hasten to add that I'm one of those who've been through the kind of academic route, and Nick's the same. But we're increasingly in shorter numbers, and there are people who I've met. I've got just anecdotally friends from Chambers who've worked in sort of NGOs, who've worked human rights organisations, they've also seen the solicitor side themselves. They've converted across to the bar. So it's really diverse and interesting as a group of people.
And what about afterwards? So I meet solicitors who move into the world of finance, for example, and they join a bank, or people who have very specialist knowledge on things like litigation regarding deal structuring or things like that, and they move in. So those are the solicitors that I tend to come across the most. In terms of barristers, do a lot of people stay as a barrister? Do they switch to other things? What kind of things do they switch to? What are the popular options that people might move into later on in their career?
I mean, I think it's always a good indication that a lot of barristers start the career and do it until they're old and barely able to work. And the cool thing is you can get to 50, the peak of your career, and then you can have an entire career change and become a judge. Not that easy, but that's what, when you speak to judges, that's what they say. They're a great advocate, they loved advocacy, and then they reached a stage where they just became a judge. And then after that, you can become an arbitrator. But I think most people do stay within the profession. And if not, I mean, different thing. People go, you're trained as an advocate. It's a really good skill. And people go into politics.
Yeah, dare I say politics, a few of those.
Yeah, that was going to be my follow-up question.
Barrister MPs. There are a lot. We went to a talk and they were saying there should be more of them. I don't know.
Historically, it pretty much was all barristers and a couple of merchants and and a few clergymen maybe, but yeah, I think it's interesting because there are people also to mention who continue to practice, but maybe they've lightened their load of work they do. And they're, say, a trustee of a charity, or they're a governor of a school. I mean, you can do that, of course, in any profession, but there does seem to be a strong propensity of barristers to involve themselves in completely different extracurricular activities. There's a lot of musicians at the bar. There's a lot of actors, probably because of the performance and the theatre of, public speaking. But not, that's not to say that they go on and do that afterwards. But that's an interest that they maintain throughout their career. And I think being a barrister does allow you to do lots of things. The only thing I have heard, this is quite amusing, is that self-employed barristers often say, they've rendered themselves so unemployable now that they'll never get a kind of job in a kind of employed setting because they're so used to their own work and their own ways of doing things. That's obviously not entirely true. They sort of, they're self-deprecating there. But you can definitely, and a lot of people do go employed, so they go into a law firm. I've got some friends who I know have done that, who've become employed barristers, so they get a more consistent salary per month rather than cases coming in as they do, and they may ebb and flow, and maybe a shortage at some points. But lots of options.
Linked to politics, also PR. I've seen a few barristers leave junior practice and go to really cool PR firms representing or crisis control, anywhere where there's a lot of negotiation. It's about you're representing people. I think that's the skill that we learn, and it's transferable for sure.
As an outsider, it would seem like the perfect career to start if you want to move into politics later on. Like if I wanted to move into politics, it seems like this is where I would start. But
I think it's obviously there. It's useful because you've got knowledge of law, and as a politician, you're a legislator, so you're creating laws, and also the skills of being on your feet. The system does operate in this country, the UK political system. I'm sure you're probably going to do a sort of political podcast at some point, maybe try and get someone in who's gone, wanting to go to politics or into something in the political world. But it does operate where if you're a very confident public speaker, you can sort of get quite far. So it helps, but I think the bar is such a diverse place now compared to probably what it was historically, which tended to be sort of, we haven't really mentioned this yet, but the sort of public school route to Oxford, Cambridge, and then the Inns of Court. That model is definitely not the same as it was, and rightly so, that there's much more diversity, interesting backgrounds, people career changing, people dual qualifying, having say qualified overseas in a different jurisdiction, qualifying then in England and Wales, becoming a barrister here. It's really common to see this these days, which is great.
But I do think it's worth adding that the advocacy we're taught as barristers compared with Nick was a big debater, still is. It's
right.
It's very different, and I have heard from sort of barrister MPs that change is not you're geared up for speaking, but you have to sort of change the way that you speak. And it's I mean, definitely that's why a lot of people do debating in anticipation of wanting to become a barrister, and it is good, but it is a very different skill. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, debating and being a barrister is slightly different. I'll be really quick here because I don't want to make this, about sort of general public speaking experiences. But I think as a debater, you have a bit more license to be as performative as you could possibly be, and you can persuade through sheer performance. Your actual arguments, the substance of your arguments in debating doesn't always win the debate. It's the way you deliver your arguments. Whereas in a courtroom, you really have to make sure that, okay, if you're persuading a jury, it could also be the performance in criminal law. But in civil law, you will not persuade a judge if you just perform to them and, make everything about theatre. It's about the quality of your submissions and whether or not you're right on the law and you're able to align your case, the facts of your case, with how the law stands. So yeah, civil law tends to disappoint those that want to be kind of actors.
It can be quite boring but effective. It's here are my 3 points, my lord. 1, 2, 3, which is, it works really well in court, but not in the House of Commons. Maybe it should do though.
Well,
it's a shame that it doesn't.
Well, that's interesting because people have criticised Sir Keir Starmer, saying that he's too clinical and he's too boring because his background as a barrister. He was clearly an incredibly talented barrister. You don't get to the position of Director of Public Prosecutions. He was a QC at a junior age without being really talented. But the quality of a barrister's submissions and, say, a politician's off-the-cuff improvised speech in the House of Commons is quite different. And I think, it's people through the social media world see politicians differently to necessarily how actually their talents lie. And I think if they saw Keir Starmer in court, they'd realise just how good he is, for example.
Do you think those skills of debating, negotiating, rhetoric have gone out of fashion a little bit? We've got Boris and Donald kind of with all these theatrics, but you're saying Sir Keir Starmer is far more effective a politician, but he's accused of being boring.
Look, in this country, I don't want to make it too political, but we definitely need a bit more boring in this country. We've got used to the psychodrama of what's been going on in the last few years and everything changing one week after another. Politics shouldn't really be that sort of, up and down. It should be relatively consistent and boring, I think. That's personally the sort of politics I like, where you get things done and you work pragmatically on problems that need to be solved. But I think that, the Boris approach in UK political terms is more effective because it shows this sort of display of charisma, this idiosyncrasy, and there's obviously a love of, eccentricism in British political culture, and he falls into that perfectly. And I think Keir isn't quite anywhere near as charismatic, but actually, if you listen to the quality of his questions and the way he's able to pin a politician down on particular issues and put a sort of an allegation to them, he's very effective at that, and that comes from his courtroom training. Doesn't always sell though to newspapers or social media, but it can be effective.
That was super interesting.
That was a really great overview.
And also like debating versus like actually
mooting and barristering, and a bit of politics in there as well. That's all right.
So we have to move to the next section, which is mostly focused on how to get there. So for university students or for those who are going to choose their degrees. So could you in a more structured way tell what you can do to become a barrister?
I'll try and cover the formal requirements, but if I miss something,
the BSB will be on you.
I've just done it as well, so I should remember it. Okay, first you have two options. You can do a law degree, or you can not do a law degree. But either way, you need to have a qualifying law degree. I think it's called by the end of it. I did non-law degree history and then the GDL, which you can still do. I know there's the SQE now. I don't think it is very well advised for the bar. I think the GDL is still the more academically rigorous.
And these are conversion courses.
These are conversion courses. You learn 7 core topics in 1 year, unless you do it part-time, which is intense. It's really intense, but you have to do it. Then once you've done that, so you'll either have finished the GDL or have finished undergrad in law. Then you can apply and do the bar course, which is the first vocational stage. So this is a 1 year or 8 months academic vocational stage where you get taught to cross-examine, you get taught to draft, all these things. And then after that, you can then apply for, or during that you can apply for, but after that you'll be called to the bar and then you can start pupillage. So I'm currently at that bar course stage. Nick is doing pupillage, and then once you've completed pupillage, then hopefully you get tenancy, and that's it. In terms of what you do along the way, a lot of it is tick box, as it is for most careers. You need to have mini pupillages, which are 2, 3, sometimes 5 days spent in chambers with a supervisor. You might attend court, you might have to do an assessment. You can do them at almost any time during. They're very competitive to get. You want to get a range of them in different areas. You want to try out different areas of law, but you want to get most of them just before you're applying, especially for commercial bar. That's what I saw, so that you sort of give them an impression of yourself. You do an assessment and then you go to interviews, and you apply for pupillage during the bar course or GDL, and you'll have many pupillages. It's mooting, which we've already talked about, which is mock court. So you'll get given some papers, maybe you'll have a partner, there'll be a problem, and you go into a mock courtroom with a mock, maybe sometimes real judge, and you argue and there'll be a winner. You want to do well at that. You want to probably win a moot. And pro bono, I think, is the third legal thing you can also do, which is sort of volunteering legal advice or representing clients in tribunals where you're allowed to. I worked for the School Exclusions Project, which is a city university initiative which represents the parents of permanently excluded children in governing body hearings and independent review panel hearings. An excellent opportunity, and you basically simulate the career that you want to do. So those are the, I think, key things that you can do other than smashing your degree and whatever academic stage you're at. And being a rounded, normal human being is really important too, beyond the law. I think you need to keep up hobbies, just keep yourself sane, because it can be quite intense.
Definitely. I think, definitely at the criminal end of the bar, you're dealing with people every day in conferences and, in court, and you need to have interpersonal skills. That's true, of course, of the civil law side as well, because you're dealing with clients, but you literally are dealing with people from every walk of life at the criminal bar, and you really do need to have that ability to understand and relate to people. So they always say, you need to develop your sort of empathetic skills, show that you've done roles that are not just highfalutin sort of academic roles and research, that you can actually speak to ordinary people, be it, having worked behind a bar or worked in a shop or worked, those sorts of things, they count. And I'm sure that, that's true of any role which has a public facing side to it.
But we do also, I think, both of us agree that for the commercial bar, which is very academic focused, I think it's probably one of the main things on their checklist when they're assessing pupilages. Mm-hmm. You still have a lot of people who don't have these interpersonal skills, and that holds them back. They might be big brains, but you can't just be a big brain. You need to, it's an interpersonal job still.
Yeah, definitely. You've got to communicate to the client in a way that they, can access the information as quickly as possible. And, you have two types of clients as a barrister. Your professional clients, they'll understand the law like you, and the lay clients who won't be familiar with the law. And the lay client just wants to know, what do I need to do to win? Or what do I need to do next in order to advance my case? And, going into long reams about, 19th century shipping cases probably won't interest them that much. So you need to just tell them in simple terms what they need to do, and that's a useful skill to develop.
And sort of coming off of this, what I found most useful for myself, and I think most beneficial in getting pupillage, was the pro bono that I did, because it involved me being outside of my comfort zone. It involved me simulating the skills I need with real clients, and I don't think you can really beat that. Many pupillages are great, you need to do them. Mooting is good, but it's also quite artificial. I think if you can deal with real clients, I think there's nothing better than that. Yeah. That's why also a lot of people at the commercial bar now are coming from being solicitors. I've seen
it's very common. Yeah,
they're transferring over in early practice, I think.
Definitely, yeah, and because they've got that more client-facing experience, and the bar is probably heading in that direction towards less sort of barristers shutting themselves away in their tiny little chambers offices with little, nice fireplaces. They need to get out and meet the clients and have more of a client-facing role as well.
Is it common to make that jump if you're a solicitor? Do many go on to become barristers, or vice versa?
I think we're talking commercial bar. From what I've seen over the years, it seems increasingly common at the top sets, and I just think it means that you've spent a longer time working. You've probably got into a top law firm doing international arbitration or something with a bit of definitely litigation. It is the Australian and New Zealand system. I think that's what they do, and I've seen definitely the London commercial bar tending a bit towards it, but not entirely.
No, I think it's definitely the case that there are more solicitors converting to become barristers than there ever used to be, and probably vice versa, in that there are more barristers going into employed practice than there used to be as well. So that's nice to see the fluidity and the options available, and I think, it speaks volumes about how the profession is less purely distinct than, we started this podcast talking about the difference between barristers and solicitor. Yes, there's differences, but because now there are higher rights of audience if you're a solicitor, because now, barristers move across and like to get employed work so that they're retained by one firm, and they definitely get instructions to work for that firm on every case that firm has, or most cases. So, that fluidity and that dynamic has changed things, but I think for the better.
And on fluidity, and kind of making a career switch or studying something completely different other than law. Let me put it to you, should you study law? I think Lord Sumption said you shouldn't if you want to become a lawyer, but what do you guys think?
We're biased, aren't we?
I have to agree with Lord Sumption on this. I have to defer to his authority. This is a great debate he had with Professor Graham Virgo at Cambridge. I remember watching this a few years ago. I've taught some undergraduate students studying law, and I was conscious, we had a debate, me against them, sort of, the virtues of studying law and not at undergrad. They were pushing back and saying, well, how can you be a proper lawyer if you've only done sort of a 1-year conversion course? And I go, well, from little I know, and now I can say, most of your law is learned in practice. The practice of law is very different to the study of law. When you study law, you often realize that there's so much assumed in these problem questions they give you. In criminal law, for example, there's no real indication about the evidence that's needed to actually prove the elements of a case. In problem questions in law school, they'll just assume that evidence will be there. In practice, that's huge. That you're doing the criminal litigation course now, you'll see it's huge. So ultimately, studying something that really excites you, that you're interested in, that's the best way to live an undergraduate life, I think. Whatever that is, and the option which we have, which is fantastic in this country, to be able to convert in 1 year. They don't have that in the US. It's a 3-year JD. They don't have that in Germany. Wow, I've got friends who are doing their PhDs in laws now. The German sort of legal culture is so many qualifications and years of academic education before you can actually become a lawyer. So I think it's really great that we have that option, and I would always promote studying something that just really interests you, and you'll develop skills that will be useful in legal practice, regardless of studying law or not.
Would you say that there are any type of courses that would be best suited to then go into law? For example, philosophy?
I wish you'd say history then, because we both...
I think history is the best. What you need to do as a barrister, you need to think, write, and read well, and also speak. But I picked up all those skills studying history, and the more I do difficult legal problems, the closer it reminds me of my history essays and dissertations I was writing. It's very similar, just different fact patterns, and you get to stand up in court and argue them, which is so fun.
Yeah, we're biased. Nick and I both did history, and we both retain our historical interest. I mean, you're still interested in the subject that you wrote about for your dissertation all these years later.
Cairo next week to look at minarets.
Wow. Fantastic. I mean, that's brilliant. I just gave a talk on a paper I wrote about the legal history of slavery under English law in the sort of early modern period. So, I haven't left my historical interest. That's the great thing. We haven't mentioned this yet. Barristers are pretty eccentric people, and they bring with them a whole eclectic mix of interests. Many of them have not studied law as an undergraduate. They study something else, and they retain that interest, and then they develop it. And actually, I think it was Lord Sumption in that debate with Graham Virgo where he said, what you do at your weekend is as important in life as what you do with your week.
And guys, can you tell us a little bit more about the application process to be a barrister? Maybe like how, even like simple things, how do you even structure a CV? Where do you apply? Just the application process to get in.
Grants and scholarships, where are they available?
Trying to tackle the scholarship stuff.
Yeah, I'll do scholarships and then pupillage, I guess. They're similar structure and approach. So for scholarships, you'll be wanting to get, if you're doing a GDL scholarship from one of the Inns of Court, and then when you're doing the bar course scholarship, these can fund your fees and more, dependent on need, but it's a competency assessment. Often it's a application form with 3 or 4 questions. They give you a list of the competencies they're assessing, And the point is to cover those competencies and prove that you meet them in every way, make it very clear, well structured. And what that means in practice is, here are my 3 points. I think for a lot of things at the bar, here are my 3 points. Don't be equivocal, just be clear. I meet this competency because I meet this competency because. It can be boring, it can look but it should be boring, it should just do the job. And then you'll have probably an interview after at Gray's Inn. You get a short advocacy problem.
So you applied to that specific inn of court?
You can apply to one inn,
okay,
and you'll get a scholarship from an inn. You have to become a member of the inn,
okay,
and you have to get qualifying sessions as well, which involves attending dinners and going to educational programs. If you complete all of that, then you can be called to the bar after you pass the bar course.
So Nick, those qualifying sessions, how accessible are they? Can it be quite expensive to attend those dinners, or is it free?
So it costs £100 for life to join one of the inns of court, which is pretty accessible. You get a scholarship from the inn. If you get a scholarship from the inn, that will be means tested, and that takes account for these kinds of things. And then it depends on the inn. Our experience with Gray's Inn, I think it is very affordable. I think the policy is something that you can get all qualifying sessions for under £100, is what Gray's Inn does, because we have residential weekends. So I'll be going to Cumberland Lodge in April with
so
some
jealous.
judges.
I never got to go because of COVID.
And we'll do witness handling and these kinds of things. And out of that, you'll get most of the qualifying sessions you need. But then you can attend. So a dinner will be £13, which is good for a 3-course meal with port in central London. So yeah, you can, I think, qualify for under £200 all in. But I mean,
And obviously, if you get a scholarship, as Nick said, you a lot of that money is going to go towards the fees of your bar course or your GDL. By the way, you can get GDL and bar course scholarships. You did mention that, I'm sure. Yeah. And so you can use some of it if you want to help fund those. And I'm pretty sure that the inn has hardship funds for those who would otherwise find it difficult to access those sorts of events. They also have hardship funds for those who are struggling in their junior years. There are scholarships available for those who have a public practice, so those in criminal chambers, or those that are basically publicly funded, legal aid funded, because it is very difficult. They don't have as high a pupillage award as commercial or civil chambers, and they often have to travel around the country to get to the court hearings, and that can come at quite an expense. So there is support there.
There are also residential scholarships, which both of us were recipients of, which entails getting a free place to live in Gray's Inn during your bar course, which I think is probably makes the biggest difference to anyone, and everyone I've spoken to wouldn't have been able to do the bar course without that. That's, I think, more than just Gray's Inn offer that. So that's an option. There are also social mobility tied scholarships now, which are new. The Keating Chambers one at Gray's Inn, and there are others.
Yeah, it's definitely more common now for particular chambers to sponsor a scholarship and possibly organise it through an inn of court or otherwise, which targets particular groups to help them achieve their career aspirations, if they otherwise don't have the means to do so. But I was going to pick up, Alex, because I know we talked earlier about the application process, and Manu, you asked and you're interested in this. Well, for pupillage, mixed up with scholarships, it's slightly different. You only apply to one inn of court for scholarship, whereas you can apply to dozens of chambers for pupillage. It generally works that you have a centralized system, much like UCAS for personal statements and university applications. You have the pupillage gateway system, which I think is really quite good in the sense that there are some complaints about how it works technologically, but if you think about it, it means that all your applications are in the same portal, rather than with law firms where I think you still have to apply to separate law firms, and you can effectively edit all of your applications through the pupillage gateway system at once, and you can apply to up to 20 chambers during the pupillage gateway process. There are some chambers that aren't within the gateway, so you can apply to more than 20 if you think about that in total. But I applied to just under 20. And that's quite common because the numbers are really tough. You know, you've got some chambers that only take, like my chamber's 2 people a year.
Wow.
And they get, you know, hundreds of applications. So you have to apply to quite a lot of chambers to make sure you're spreading your chances. And each application takes a similar form. There'll be 3 or 4 questions of 200 to 300 words, maybe. Why these chambers? Why the commercial bar, or why this area of the bar? You know, describe a time when you've done X. Competency question, classic question, which you will have heard sisters talking about as well. And I always advise the STAR technique. Little shout out to the STAR technique: situation, task, action, result. Works wonders. And then other questions as well. And what they're really looking for is that you've cross-referenced the criteria that they will put on their website. My biggest piece of advice is always copy and paste that criteria into a separate document. And as you're going through your application, check, have I met the 5 criteria for these chambers? It might be, you know, temperance, it might be motivation, interpersonal skills, advocacy, written, oral, and something else. And integrity is often one as well. And then you can show per question an example of those particular criterion. And it's a really effective way of doing these application forms. And the one question that, you know, often people ask is, well, can you just sort of use the same answers for different chambers? And to be honest, no, because there is a real risk that you're just going to come across as a generic applicant. You need to show that you've specifically tailored your application to that chambers. You've researched what they do, some of the, you know, people involved there that have interesting practice areas that you wanted to do yourself, or you may have done a mini pupillage with them, so you've got some experience of meeting people within those chambers. But each application has to be specifically tailored. That's not to say that, you know, some answers aren't going to be the same, because it might just be, why do you want to be a barrister? You can of course use that for each chambers, but if it's why these chambers, clearly you need to personalize it. Is there anything else to add? Well, interviews, we haven't come on to that yet, have we?
Yeah, I think on what you just said, I agree entirely, but I do think, or the way I went about it was, a question you'll be asked is why you, or why you at our chambers. I definitely did create a constant structure or answer to that, which I could then mold to the chambers. So sort of just 3 core categories. You have to have this introspective process and think, well, why me? What are my strengths? And then I had the 3 strengths I outlined, and then for each chambers I then molded those strengths to what they were looking for, and they're often quite similar. I think they all want you at the commercial bar to have be academic, be a good written and oral advocate, and have the sort of temperament they're looking for. I mean, you can sort of go from a high level structure and then focus in on each specific chambers.
Definitely, yeah, that's really good advice. I mean, yeah, and the same criteria tends to apply through to interviews as well, and the process will draw out those skill sets from you. So there tends to be 2 interviews. Some even have 3, I've heard, but most of the time it's 2. And there may also be a written assessment in that process as well. So it could be 3 parts before you actually get an offer, if you do or not. And on these interviews, the first interview, I mean, you're closer, your memory will be better of this than mine, but the first one tends to be a bit more of a sort of personal overview interview, interested in you as a person, what you've done, your motivations for applying, and the second interview is a bit more challenging and technical. Is that right?
Definitely, but they do vary so much. Some will be grueling from the get-go. No, they don't care about your CV. Here's 2 hours, here's a problem, come in, 5 barristers, 2 QCs, let's grill you on an issue.
Cases now.
Sunday, that was 8 a.m. on a Sunday morning, first round interview at a Chambers. Read this for 2 hours and then just get grilled on it. Horrendous. But then other ones would be talk about your CV, do a little advocacy. There'll always be a small advocacy exercise. But then the second interview will always be much more challenging.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely. I'm maybe being a bit soft in my approach. I think we're playing sort of good cop bad cop here, and I was trying to lighten the experience.
Trying to make it.
Yeah,
it's hard.
It's hard.
It's grueling and hard.
Yeah,
part of the fun of it as well. I mean, I enjoyed doing them, but
Yeah.
they make you think so I think they've got very high caliber candidates, and the only way you pick through them is by challenging them all.
Mm-hmm.
And the ones where I felt most challenged were the ones that went better. I think that's sort of often true.
Definitely. Oh, it's so hard to predict when you're going to get a callback. I sometimes thought, oh yeah, I know that went really well, that first interview. I felt like I had a synergy with the panel, and then you don't get a call back for a second interview. You go, oh, I don't understand. But the ones where you're challenged and you're pushed, sometimes they're the ones where you get called back and you think, okay, interesting, because it's hard to be, a judge of when you've done well in something. They'll, be judging you, and they'll have their own criteria per chambers.
What's the candidate experience like? Is it likely you'll hear back if you're not successful? How long does it take?
So I think the student room pupillage 2022/3.
Please don't use the student room. Let's not refer to that.
Lambasted.
Good citation.
Try this again. But yeah, there's this reply by silence thing. It's basically eradicated. I think there's like 1 or 2 chambers who still do it, and they got called out for it this year. And I think it's basically gone. They do tell you nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, I have had that. Couple of chambers just not even say anything, and then what happens is your pupillage gateway status changes. From application submitted to sort of rejected or something, and you're like, oh, that's nice. And you've not heard from a letter or an email or anything. Well, they don't send letters actually in the process. It's just emails. But I think now, because of the process, because it's overseen by the Bar Council, who represent the profession as a whole, it is much more streamlined, more organised, fair, transparent. Clearly, there are still some work to be done, but I found the process to be certainly not. It's not enjoyable when I go through it again, but I think you can prepare for it. What I would recommend is, and this is an opportunity to plug some mentoring, but definitely find yourself a mentor or people that, like Nick and I, have been through the process a few years before, who can guide you. I honestly think it's great to listen to senior barristers talk, but when they went through the process, it was very different, wasn't it? I mean, nowadays,
a lot more nepotism.
Probably, but nowadays it's there's no nepotism involved. It is pure talent, and it's quite unjust. There's a lot of really good people that have to take a long time to get there, or don't.
It's very hard to generalize for pupillage applications just because each chambers is so very different. But I think the common theme is a push towards CV blind application screening.
Yeah.
Not taking account of universities, trying to make it a points based, fair and equitable thing, which I think is still it is, but I think it's just the nature of it. I think they're struggling. Some chambers are better than others, and I don't know what your thoughts were. I definitely went into some where I felt this feels very fair. Some had equality and diversity, a person from a professional equality and diversity person sitting in on the interview and checking that there was no sort of unconscious bias in marking, and I thought, this is better than most chambers. That seems more. It's really
good. That's really good. No, I don't recall. I mean, most of my interviews took place online. I was applying during the pandemic, still in a pandemic, but during lockdown phase, etc. So, it's difficult. They try to be as transparent as they can be with their criteria on their websites. There are some chambers that are really good at actually saying, we will mark you, assign certain marks per criteria, and then the top X will go through to the next round, and then after that the top 2 are in the final round will be chosen. And that's really great. I think if you have that level of transparency, you're absolutely clear as to what's expected of you and what's going to happen. Some don't provide that, but the trajectory is towards more transparency. So I do think that in that way it's getting in the right direction.
On mentoring,
yes,
I think we've spoken a little bit about the Young Bar mentoring scheme, which you set up, Nick. Could you tell us a little bit about that and what you might be able to offer and what you guys do? Yeah,
absolutely. Very happy to, Alex. So it was set up in October last year, and as I just mentioned, the impetus was that I think the best form of mentoring is from those who've just been through the process. I think it's really useful to hear from senior practitioners about their own practice, about how the bar's changed, about the cases that they've worked on, and the impressive things they've done. But ultimately, when you're applying, you need to speak to people who are 1, 2, 3 years ahead of you, because they will be able to say, this is a way you should structure an application. This is how you should respond to certain questions in an interview. This is how you should deal with an intervention in an interview scenario, because they've it's fresh in their minds. They've been through it recently, and so we set up Young Bar Mentoring. Rosanna and I, and we did the bar course together. We weren't on the same course, but we were in the same year, and the impetus was to literally have that sense of people mentoring each other who had just been successful and been through the same process. It's been a really great first few months and year of the scheme. Over 200 people mentored. We've got a new cycle of mentees we're trying to recruit to have a mentor for the bar course scholarship application process, for pupillage, and also for the GDL scholarship application process. So always happy to offer advice myself to people who are interested, and we have lots of great mentors who are willing to step in and mentor people. So definitely recommend it. But there's also others out there, and I should plug a few other names like Bridging the Bar, Bida Bar, which is promoting disability at the bar. The Inns of Court have their own mentoring schemes too, and there are plenty of others that Chambers run. So lots of great mentoring opportunities, and you have to seize those, because honestly, mentoring really helps. You had a mentor?
I had a mentor, yeah, through Grey's Inn.
Good.
She was lovely. She was great. Gave me a lot of insider tips. But I had a mentor when I was younger, and I found that a bit more helpful.
Yeah.
During undergrad.
It would be great to also hear about your extracurricular experiences. And Nick L, I know you were secretary of the Oxford Union.
Yep.
You worked in a tech startup.
Yep.
You were quite active when we met at UCL. How have those experiences informed or enriched your career aims and your path?
Yeah, I mean, the advantage of being a perennial student, Alex, is that you get to experience a lot of student societies. So that's part of the joy.
Time in the game.
Yeah, exactly. No, I definitely wanted to have a broad university experience. It's all well and good studying, and I enjoy being a student for sure. But I think getting involved with different societies, taking on leadership responsibilities for me, a few years ago held the same role Nick does for the Grey's Inn Student Association. Fantastic experience. Get to work with lots of people, coordinate events, help people, who are interested in certain career paths to meet practitioners in those fields. And I certainly found that my involvement with, for example, Alex, I was at UCI, I was involved with the University of London Law Society. Nick will come on, I'm sure, talk about his own experiences with law societies and the Bar Society at UCL. Getting that exposure to the profession, having not even studied law, was really helpful for me in informing me. That's the sort of work I want to do, because I met some of these interesting people. And then, into different roles. Also getting work experience outside of law. You mentioned the startup role I did, and that was great. It was really interesting to work in this software development startup. I knew nothing about software, still really don't. But on the business development side of things, seeing the sort of the software developers and the business developers, two different spaces, but how they come together to create a startup and then launch it and take it further and hopefully get funding. That's amazing to see. And actually, you realize when you're doing practical work in a legal context, every different case. Every case is different, and you have to become a kind of mini expert of lots of different areas, even if you've never had any previous experience with them. So actually having done other things will just help you, because you'll have a sense of what that setting's like. So, it could be construction, it could be shipping, it could be banking, company director duties, whatever it is. You need to get your head around the context and the environment within which those sorts of organizations are working. So doing other experiences will help you to do that.
So we've said you make a great double act, Nick and Nick. You've both got a wealth of experiences. Nick said, I know we met at the UCL Law for All Society when you were bar careers officer. It's great to see you kind of really come into fruition.
Yeah, I manifested that.
Exactly, way back. Tell us a little bit about what you've done too, and I know you're currently president of the Association of Gray's Inn Students. You're the voice of the student body at Gray's Inn. It'd be great to hear about that.
Yeah, for sure. Back then, second year of undergrad, I've been involved in student societies for law, and I think the reason I got involved was it is hard as a non-law student to do bar-related things because there's not that much out there. I mean, we put on moots at UCL, but I found myself going to King's to do moots because there wasn't that much provision. So I've kept it going because I wanted to provide stuff for other students. So I did see a gap there. And we tried to create a UCL bar society, which still exists, and to put on more moot competition. It's mooting that you want to make more accessible to non-law students. And now I thought, why not run for the president of the Association of Gray's Inn Students in Nick's footsteps.
It only goes to someone called Nick. That's the requirement. No, I'm joking.
And yeah, do more of the same. So we're the student voice of Gray's Inn Students, and the students are a really important part of the inn. And because the inn is full of barristers, benches, but the focus really should be on this educational, vocational element, which everyone is required to do, and sort of overcoming any challenges that students face. So again, we're putting on moots for students. It's more of the same, but also social events and tackling any issues that come up. It's a good role. It's enriching. It really has seen me integrate myself into the student and Gray's Inn community, and I'm having a lot of fun with it.
Once you get the acceptance letter, what would be the salary expectations, short term and long term?
Well, I'll do my best here. I mean, so there's a massive range of pupillage award between the criminal bar to the commercial bar. Now, whether or not that's right is a different question. In personal view, it's not that there's such a disparity, but criminal pupil barristers can probably expect to make anything from, and I've heard some very low figures outside of London, 12,000 or something like that, because it's technically just your kind of year of training, to something like 20 to 30. Some are higher than that, criminal pupilages. Some are in the 40s and 50s, I think, and those tend to be in London. Whereas with civil chambers, it's within the higher bracket of that, 40 to say 60. Commercial chambers is probably north of 60, and the highest I've heard now is there's Gray's Inn tax chambers. I think they've literally raised the bar to 100,000. So that's sort of more than any training contract. But in terms of what you can expect to earn, it's all a bit taboo. I don't want to put a figure on it, but I think at the commercial bar, the kind of more pure commercial bar, which Nick will be going to, they do say that, at junior tenant level, you do very, very well for yourself. You certainly are on a par with those in the sort of big city law firms, if not more. Depends on your own work and how much you actually do. But in terms of other areas of the bar, it's obviously going to be comparably less, and it's particularly difficult for criminal barristers. And I just need to plug that because I think that's something that's been very topical at the moment, the challenges that face criminal barristers. So if you are considering the career path, then finance is an important consideration to take into account.
Also worth mentioning that you pay chambers rent, which can be anywhere from, I think, 10 to 20% of your earnings.
Important, yeah.
You have no pension, you have no healthcare, unless you choose to create one yourself. So you're self-employed as well. That's worth remembering.
Exactly.
How many hours per week do you normally need to expect to work?
It's up to you.
Work-life balance.
Definitely up to you. I mean,
you can choose. I mean, I was talking to the clerks at the chambers I was joining. They said, we will sit down with you and you can tell us how many days a week you want to work. If you want to work 7 days a week, we've got enough work for you to do that. And do you want to earn more or less? The good thing I've heard from a female perspective is when you want to raise a family, you can choose to take on less cases, work less, look after your children, and there's that flexibility there for you, which is good. And
no, I think at the pupil level, which I'm doing right now, it's slightly different. There is more of a self-contained work hour expectation, because they don't want you to be sort of drowned in work from day one. They want to train you. Certainly my chambers, a big part of the ethos is we're training you this year and we're making you to be the barrister of the future. And so, I'm going in at around 9 o'clock each day, and I come back at 6:30, something like that. It depends. Sometimes my supervisor will let me go a little earlier if he's done or she's done, and there's nothing else to be done that day, or we've had a court hearing and it's finished early or something like that. But I have stayed in a little later if I'm working on something for another member of chambers. It is up to you. You can effectively do your own hours, and I think what's lovely about pupillage is, although you are in that grey area between being a sort of trainee and a member of chambers, they do try and treat you well. Certainly my chambers, it's not true necessarily everywhere, but they do try and treat you like an adult and part of the furniture already. So they're trying to get you to sort of, build up your own experience of, reading through case papers, having a go at your own pleadings, your own draft submissions. And they're really keen to get right from the get-go in the mindset of a self-employed practitioner. So the hours, aren't crippling at the pupil end, but I'm sure they get a lot worse at the tenancy end when you start taking on your own cases and things are thrown at you all the time.
I think it must be more satisfying to work crippling hours if you know that money goes in your pocket. That's the only justification I can make.
Yeah, and I should also say that I have heard that some criminal pupils are having a very tough time then, because I think the work is really ramped up in light of strike action and challenges around the criminal bar. So it's certainly not the case that all pupils have a standard set of hours, but it's usually pretty well organised, and each chambers will vary, but they don't want you to be absolutely off your feet. They want you to be learning and doing the best that you can to hopefully become a tenant.
I think this leads us on nicely to speak a little bit about the culture at the bar. So my question is twofold. The first part is more about this reputation of you have to be rich, you have to have gone to Oxbridge to become a barrister. We've spoken about nepotism, salary expectations being a bit taboo. Does everybody have to be called Nick to become a barrister?
That is one of the requirements. It's somewhere in the rules. No,
it's a place steeped in tradition, but what's the reality like? Is it changing?
Yes, but it depends would be my answer. I think from an Inns of Court perspective, entirely the sort of old school, it's steeped in tradition, but the focus now I think is skills and education. The whole dining culture is decreasing, becoming much less important, which is probably a good thing, because the function, keeping the networks together is good because you do get informal experiences which are accessible. That's not, I don't think, a bad thing. When I say it depends, I think it does depend on which chambers you're looking at. Some are much more progressive, it's the old culture is gone, whereas others, you hear stories that it's pretty much hasn't changed, and they're sort of their own ecosystems which self-repeat because they select their pupils and they just pick people who are like them. But it's not like it used to be anywhere, but I think it does depend.
Yeah, every chambers is different, I'm sure, but it strikes me and what others say that the bar has massively changed, and the pace of change is increasing ever. So, the opportunities now to get scholarships for those who otherwise wouldn't have been able to have got them a few years ago or a few decades ago, that's fantastic, and that clearly does promote diversity and inclusion with ways that the profession didn't used to do. So I think that the culture of the bar honestly is really collegiate. I always think going to Hall, Gray's Inn, there are traditions. Yes, it's quite amusing seeing people, singing, reading out poetry after the dinner. This sounds very eccentric, but this is actually what happens. But we do it in a way that's lighthearted and collective. And I've met people literally from so many different common law jurisdictions from all over the world who are doing their bar course or who are practicing in Hall, and it's just so nice to have that sort of experience of learning from others, and I don't think you'd get that. And I will just say this, as a solicitor, I don't think you would get the same experience of meeting people across the profession. So, you know, criminal barristers, family law barristers, civil, commercial, all in the same, you know, people who are employed in law firms, people who are judges, parts of the judiciary at different levels, all in the same hall setting of an inn of court. You're not going to have that if you work in a law firm. The people you'll be mixing all the time will be people at your law firm and your sort of clients in a more corporate setting, or if you work at a different sort of law firm, that setting. So you get that cross section and that collegiality at the bar, and I'm a big believer that that's what promotes the real enjoyment of the job and the system you operate in.
I think so, and also. The Oxbridge question is one which I think a lot of students do get worked up and worried about, and I think that's gone. But there might be one or two chambers I can think of where they just weirdly don't accept anyone unless they've been to Oxbridge, but it doesn't exist. I didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. Both of us did our undergraduate degrees at UCL. Mm-hmm. It's never been a bar at all. It's entirely skills and competency. Can you do the job? It's a very practical job. You can learn those skills in any setting. If anything, the Oxbridge thing is probably partly a correlation in intellect rather than any requirement by any means.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Nick. It is changing. There are going to be certain chambers that have pupillage committees who are looking for particular candidates, and it might be that certain accolades, like an Oxbridge degree, stands out more to them than other accolades. But those chambers are increasingly in the minority, and the vast majority of chambers are interested in not where you studied, how you studied and how well you did, and the sort of person you are and how suitable you are to the profession. So times are definitely changing.
One last question.
Sure.
Do you have any life lessons, any anecdotes you want to share so far in your journey on becoming a barrister? Do you have any, what makes you tick? What makes you guys, what drives you?
Oh, gosh. Well, I'd say something that I'm always motivated by is doing a good job. It's been that way my whole life, pretty much. I'm a very competitive person, and that is a trait you'll see at the bar. People, it's an adversarial profession. At the end of the day, it's the prosecution against the defence. It's a claimant against the defendant. You're an advocate and you want to win. So I'm someone who wants to win and also do a good job in that process. But anecdotally, something that I really enjoyed, probably my favourite experience, which massively helped me actually in the application process, was I was part of the Gray's Inn Jessup team. So the Jessup moot is the largest moot in the world. It's an international law moot. Nick's also doing a big moot at the moment called the Viz moot, which we'll talk about maybe in a bit. And I mooted along with 4 of my friends. We never met each other in person, amazingly, because it was all online. It was all during lockdown number 3, I believe.
You can't punch anyone online.
No, you can't. No, you can't, fortunately. So, not that I would. But, it's a very competitive process, the Jessup, and we got on so well. What was amazing is none of us had any experience of international law before the moot. We trained ourselves. We had a little input from some really nice members of Gray's Inn who were willing to help, but they were quite junior themselves in their own career. We didn't have any sort of formal university institutional coaching, whereas all the teams, that went very far in the competition did. And I think, because of our culture and our ethos and the sort of camaraderie we had, we worked really well as a group. We gelled, and we went on to win the UK nationals, and then we qualified for the global rounds and got pretty far. Sadly, got knocked out in the octafinals by the team that went on to win the University of Sydney, and that is still a sore point for me. Yeah, well, it's not quite second, Nick, but I'll take that. Losing to the winners is like runner-up, really, isn't it? So that for me, honestly, set that sense of, this is the sort of job I want to do. It's great fun to be in front of different judges from around the world, competing, trying to win, argue your points. So, and that I hope is what the profession will live up to, and that's kind of what makes me tick is doing a good job and hoping to work with talented people and win.
So what makes me tick? I think it comes out of the reason why I wanted to go to the bar, an answer I've already given. But I do really enjoy, weirdly, sadistically, being outside of my comfort zone. Maybe sadistic was a bit too strong.
Where we go with this?
Not quite sadism. Yeah, being outside of my comfort zone, I love it. And the bar, I think, constantly puts me outside of my comfort zone, and that's what I enjoy for sure.
Brilliant.
What else? What was the other question? Any life lessons?
Any anecdotes so far? Any stories from your journey? Anything you'd like to share with a current student, maybe in university or in school, who wants to be a barrister? Any turning points in your life that come to mind that might be useful?
I don't know if this is. I mean, I once hosted a quiz with Lady Hale. That was pretty cool. So I don't look. This is what's great about. So this is an anecdote in the sense that it will show you that the bar brings you into contact with unbelievably interesting people at the highest points of the profession. So Lady Hale was recently retired as the president of the UK Supreme Court, and we were running a quiz for the Barristers Committee and the Students Committee, and she was the quiz master, the sort of the MC, and I was the MC basically. So she read out the questions, and I sort of introduced, along with my my friend Gwyn, the questions and how it was going to how it was all going to work. And it was really fun. And you realise, she had a light-hearted approach to it. You realise, these people, high-flying achievers in the profession are normal people as well. She always makes an effort, Lady Hale, or Master Hale, as you call her at Gray's Inn, and often she goes by Brenda as well. It's amazing to go and speak to students, to go and makes a conscious effort to make them feel like they're at home. So I do honestly think it is a collegiate profession. It's one where the older generations give back to the new, and that's part of your expectation if you get a scholarship, isn't it? You have to give back. They'll be getting us back all the time.
You sign a contract.
Yeah.
No, but you feel like you owe the inn. You want to give back for sure. The amount they give you, they give us the leg up to get into the profession.
Yeah.
And once we're there, I think I feel obligated certainly to go back, help the students, because it is self-replicating. Right?
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
That was amazing, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Guys.
There's so much more we could ask you. I think you've given us a great overview. Really enjoyed hearing everything you had to say. Thank you for coming on.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you
us.
very much, everyone.
Great. Would you like to plug anything at the end? Are you happy for students to contact you on LinkedIn or?
Absolutely, Manu. Yeah, I mean, I have mentioned Young Bar mentoring and other mentoring schemes. That is something that I recommend people get involved with mentoring if they're interested. But happy to be contacted on LinkedIn, and very happy to answer any questions that people have about this very strange and esoteric profession, but I hope we've decoded it a little bit today.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.